Lena had always lived a quiet life, the kind of life where neighbors waved politely but rarely lingered. Her house was modest, a small brick home with a tidy garden she spent hours tending to. Flowers of all colors bloomed in neat little rows, and the faint scent of lavender drifted from the window boxes whenever she opened them. She liked her routines, her small moments of peace. Every morning she would wake up early, make herself a cup of coffee, and sit on the porch while Shadow, her loyal German shepherd, lay stretched out on the grass beside her. Shadow had been with her for 7 years, and the bond they shared was unspoken but undeniable. Lena knew he would do anything to protect her, just as she would for him. Her neighborhood was quiet most of the time. It was the kind of place where children played in the streets during the day, and people waved as they walked their dogs in the evenings. But even in quiet neighborhoods, tension sometimes lurked beneath the surface. There had been whispers about a gang in the area, a group of people who believed they could intimidate anyone who didn't fit their narrow view of the world. They had targeted a few homes before, mostly ones they thought were easy to rob. People talked about it quietly, never daring to challenge them directly. Lena had heard the rumors, but she had never thought much about it. Her house, she believed, was just another home in the row, unnoticed and safe. Lena worked at a local bookstore, a small shop with shelves stacked from floor to ceiling with stories waiting to be discovered. She loved her job because it allowed her to meet people, share recommendations, and get lost in other worlds for a little while each day. She had a few regular customers who would ask about her garden or about Shadow, and she enjoyed those small connections. Shadow, of course, had become something of a neighborhood celebrity himself. Everyone who met him remarked on how calm he was around people, but also how alert he became if anything seemed out of place. Even though Lena lived quietly, she had a keen sense of her surroundings. She noticed the way people looked at her when she walked by, the way some cars seemed to linger too long at intersections, the way certain voices carried in the wind when she was outside. One evening, as she and Shadow returned from a long walk, she noticed a car slowly circling the block. The driver's window was down, and Lena could make out faint laughter but not the words. Shadow stiffened, his ears perked, and he growled low in his throat, a warning that something wasn't right. Lena whispered to him, "It's okay, boy, just keep walking." But she didn't feel reassured herself. Over the next few days, Lena began noticing other small signs. Footsteps that didn't belong, voices carrying a little too close, shadows that moved oddly near the edges of her property. She felt the stirrings of unease but didn't want to overreact. Lena was not the type to live in fear, but something about the way the neighborhood had changed made her heart race slightly whenever she returned home. Shadow, ever vigilant, never left her side, his presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone. She tried to maintain her usual routines, going to the bookstore each day, watering her garden, and taking long walks in the evenings, but the sense of being watched lingered. One afternoon, she was pruning her roses when Shadow suddenly barked sharply and ran toward the edge of the yard. Lena followed, and in the corner of the fence she noticed footprints that hadn't been there before. They led away from the house and toward the back alley. Her heart thumped. She felt a mixture of anger and caution. Someone had been close to her home, and Shadow had noticed before she did. Lena realized she couldn't ignore these signs anymore. She started talking to her neighbors more, trying to gauge if they had noticed anything unusual. Some shrugged it off, while others admitted they had seen strange people in the area, but they didn't want to get involved. Lena understood that hesitation. The gang had a reputation, and fear had a way of silencing even the bravest. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to be ready. She began small preparations, making sure doors were locked, adding a few extra lights around the property, and spending more time observing Shadow as he patrolled their little territory. Shadow seemed to sense Lena's growing anxiety. He would circle the house more than usual, sit near the windows where shadows fell, and sometimes growl at nothing she could see. Lena would talk to him softly, trying to calm both herself and him. "We'll be okay," she whispered one evening as she sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. Shadow rested his head on her lap, his eyes alert and wise, as if he understood her fears and shared her determination to protect their home. Lena also thought about what it meant to live in a world where people assumed you were weak or easy to scare. She thought about her friends and family, the challenges they had faced and the resilience they had shown. Lena was proud of her independence and her ability to handle life on her own. But she also knew that resilience didn't mean ignoring danger. It meant being aware, prepared, and when necessary, standing firm. One evening, as Lena returned from work, she noticed something unusual: a group of teenagers lingering near the corner of the street. Their faces were partly hidden under hoods, and they seemed to be whispering among themselves while glancing at her house. Shadow's body stiffened immediately, and he barked once sharply, causing the teenagers to jump and scatter. Lena's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "Good boy," she said softly, patting Shadow on the head. Her voice was calm, but inside she felt a surge of protective anger. Someone had been watching her house, and she knew it. That night, Lena sat at her kitchen table, Shadow lying at her feet, and thought about what she had learned over the past weeks. She realized that her quiet life, her independence, and even her garden could not make her invisible. People might underestimate her because she lived alone, because she was a black woman in a neighborhood where some still held prejudiced views. But Lena knew she had something they did not expect: her awareness, her courage, and her loyal companion by her side. Shadow was more than a pet. He was a partner, a guardian, and a friend who would never abandon her. As she sipped her tea and watched the stars through the kitchen window, Lena made a silent promise. If anyone ever thought they could come into her life, take what was hers, or threaten her peace, they would soon discover that she was far from helpless. She had spent her life learning how to survive, how to protect herself, and how to ensure that those who underestimated her would regret it. Shadow lifted his head, sensing her resolve, and wagged his tail lightly as if to say, "I'm with you." Lena smiled. Together they were ready for whatever might come next, knowing that their bond and courage were stronger than fear. Life continued its quiet rhythm for the next few days, with Lena going about her routines and Shadow keeping watch. But beneath the calm, a storm was quietly forming, one that would test their courage and loyalty in ways they had never imagined. Lena didn't know the gang would soon attempt to invade her home, thinking she was just another easy target. She didn't know how close danger really was. But she did know that she would not be an easy mark, and Shadow would never let her face it alone. And with that knowledge, Lena felt a strength she hadn't realized she had, a strength that came from living each day fully, with eyes open, heart steady, and a faithful friend at her side. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every sound seem louder than it really was. Lena had gone to visit a friend a few blocks away, leaving Shadow behind at home. She had felt a little uneasy about leaving him alone, but she knew Shadow was smart and cautious. He had spent years learning the rhythms of their home, knowing when a leaf fell in the yard or when someone passed by the street. Still, as she walked down the sidewalk, she couldn't shake a sense that something was about to happen. Back at her house, Shadow paced near the window, his ears twitching at every distant sound. He sniffed the air, picking up scents Lena could never have imagined. He heard the faint crunch of gravel under shoes, the subtle jingle of metal that didn't belong, and the quiet, whispered voices of strangers moving carefully through the darkness. Shadow's instincts screamed that these were not ordinary visitors. These were people who did not belong, people who had chosen her house for reasons she would never approve of. The gang had been watching Lena for some time. They had noticed her routine, the quiet confidence with which she moved through her life, and had assumed she would be easy to intimidate. That evening, they had decided to break in, thinking they could make a quick profit before anyone noticed. They laughed quietly as they crept toward the house, confident that no one would interfere. They did not count on Shadow. Shadow stayed low at first, hidden in the shadows of the living room. He could smell the intruders, and every instinct in his body told him to act, but he also knew he had to wait for the right moment. He had learned from Lena that rushing into danger without a plan was never wise. Still, his growl rumbled deep in his chest, a warning that danger was near. The gang reached the front door. One of them, the tallest of the group, jiggled the handle, convinced it would open. When it didn't, he smirked and tried the back door, thinking it would be unlocked. Shadow crept closer, silent but deadly, watching their every move. When one of the intruders found a window slightly open and tried to pry it further, Shadow barked sharply, startling them. They froze, looking around, and laughed it off, thinking it was just the wind or some neighborhood dog. Shadow's growl grew louder, and the intruders finally realized that something was not right. Inside the house, Shadow moved quickly and quietly, positioning himself where he could see the intruders without being seen. He watched as they rifled through drawers and cabinets, tossing things aside carelessly, mocking the home they thought belonged to someone weak. Their voices were cruel, filled with ignorance and prejudice, and every word stung in Shadow's ears as if he could understand the anger beneath them. Shadow knew he had to protect Lena's home, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He ran from his hiding spot to the corner where the intruders were distracted, knocking over a vase that shattered loudly on the floor. The sound made one of them jump and the others cursed, looking around for the source of the noise. Shadow used the confusion to move closer, his powerful presence filling the room without them realizing how close he was. The intruders continued to search, thinking they were safe, still laughing at the idea of taking from someone they believed was an easy target. They didn't notice the subtle signs Shadow left behind: scratches on the floorboards, fur caught on furniture, and the faint scent trail he had made to track their movements. Every little mark would become a clue later, a piece of evidence they could not erase. Meanwhile, Lena's neighbor had noticed unusual activity, but hesitated to call the police immediately. The neighborhood had a quiet understanding about danger. People watched and waited, hoping it would pass without interference. Shadow's growls and barks finally reached the neighbor's ears, and though hesitant, they peeked through their window to see the intruders inside Lena's home. The sight was enough to make their heart race, but fear kept them from acting immediately. Back inside, Shadow continued to observe, calculating his next move. The intruders were careless, tossing valuable items into bags without checking if there were hidden cameras or alarms. They mocked the home and everything in it, assuming no one would fight back. Shadow, however, was far from ordinary. His eyes glimmered with intelligence and determination. He moved silently from room to room, ensuring that nothing happened to the heart of the home. The gang finally decided they had taken enough and began to leave, unaware of the evidence Shadow had left behind. They did not notice the small pile of fur on the floor, the marks on the doorframe, or the broken vase that would later tell a story of their presence. They did not hear the faint growl that followed them to the door, a silent warning that someone or something was always watching. After the intruders left, Shadow sat in the living room, ears perked, listening for any sign of return. The house was quiet again, but the energy of the intrusion lingered. Shadow knew Lena would return soon, and he needed to be ready. When she walked through the door a few hours later, Shadow greeted her with a low growl, nuzzling her hand and leading her through the house. Lena immediately sensed something was wrong. The door had been disturbed, items were out of place, and the subtle signs of a break-in were clear. Her heart sank as she realized what had happened, but there was also a spark of pride in her chest. Shadow had protected the home, had observed the intruders, and had marked the evidence they had left behind. Lena felt a surge of gratitude and relief. "Good boy, Shadow," she whispered, patting his head. He wagged his tail, alert and proud, knowing he had done his duty. Lena called the police, reporting the break-in, but she also knew she could not rely solely on them. The gang had left, but they were still in the neighborhood, still a threat. Shadow's instincts had been right, and Lena realized she needed to be more vigilant than ever. She began making a list of what was taken, what was disturbed, and what signs the intruders had left. Every small detail mattered, and Shadow stayed by her side, watching, alert, and ready for anything. As she cleaned up the broken vase and rearranged the scattered items, Lena felt a mixture of anger and determination. This had not been just a theft. It had been an attack on her space, her life, and her independence. She realized that the gang had underestimated her, assuming she was weak, alone, and easily intimidated. But they had misjudged Shadow, and more importantly, they had misjudged her. Lena would not let this go unnoticed. That night, Lena and Shadow sat together in the living room, the quiet hum of the city outside their windows. Lena reflected on what had happened and thought about how she would respond. She knew she needed a plan, a way to protect herself and ensure that the gang could not return without facing consequences. Shadow rested his head on her lap, his presence a comforting reminder that she was never truly alone. Together they began to think about the steps they would take, knowing that intelligence, patience, and loyalty would be their greatest weapons. Even as Lena went to bed that night, she could not sleep fully. Her mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and precautions. Shadow lay at the foot of her bed, alert even in sleep, ready to spring into action if needed. Lena realized that the calm life she had cherished was now under threat. But she also knew that calmness could be restored through vigilance, courage, and the bond she shared with Shadow. They were more than a woman and a dog. They were a team, prepared to face any danger that came their way. By the time morning came, Lena felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would not be a victim. She would not allow the gang to believe they could intimidate her or take what was hers without consequence. Shadow wagged his tail as if sensing her resolve, and together they prepared to face the next steps. Lena knew that this was just the beginning, and the story of their courage and determination was far from over. Lena woke up the next morning with a mix of unease and determination. The events of the previous night had left a mark on her, not just in her home but in her mind. She walked into the living room, Shadow trotting faithfully at her heels, and surveyed the damage. The broken vase had been swept aside, drawers were slightly open, and the faint disarray of her home was enough to remind her that someone had violated her space. Shadow stood near the window, ears alert, eyes scanning every corner as if expecting the intruders to reappear at any moment. As she began putting things back in order, Lena felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, but also a strange sense of clarity. She realized that the gang had underestimated her, assuming that because she lived alone, she would be easy to intimidate. They had misjudged not just her, but Shadow too. She knelt down, stroking his head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers, and whispered, "They're not going to get away with this, boy. Not while we're here." Shadow wagged his tail but didn't relax, and Lena knew that his instincts were sharper than any warning sign she could have noticed herself. Lena decided that she needed more than just awareness to protect herself. She needed information. She called the police, reporting every detail she could remember. The sound of the intruders, the way they had moved through the house, even the graffiti they had left near the back fence. She described every small detail, including the broken vase and the scattered belongings. The officer on the phone assured her they would send someone to take a report, but Lena knew that she couldn't rely solely on the authorities. Sometimes waiting for help was not enough, especially when people were careless and bold. After hanging up, she began to think about the gang itself. Who were they? How long had they been targeting the neighborhood? What had they wanted from her? Lena knew she had to approach this carefully. Confrontation could be dangerous, but careful observation and strategy could turn the tables. She looked at Shadow and smiled slightly. He had been her silent protector, but together they could gather the information they needed. She started small. She went through the house, noting every sign that the intruders had left behind. There were footprints on the porch, faint scratches on the floor, and small pieces of debris that did not belong. Lena carefully photographed everything with her phone. She knew that even the smallest details could be useful later, whether for police evidence or her own understanding of the gang's methods. Shadow stayed close, sniffing around, clearly aware of every sound and movement. Lena admired his focus. His instincts were precise and his loyalty was unwavering. Over the next few days, Lena began observing her neighborhood more closely. She noticed patterns she had missed before, certain cars lingering at odd hours, people walking slowly past her house, and the occasional glance that lingered too long. She took notes discreetly, mapping the times and locations of these suspicious activities. Shadow was always at her side, guiding her when she walked through alleys or down quiet streets, ensuring they were never caught off guard. Lena also started talking to a few neighbors she trusted. Some were hesitant at first, worried about retaliation if they spoke up, but Lena's calm and measured approach encouraged them to share what they knew. They told her about other break-ins, about times when the gang had come close but retreated when someone seemed aware. Lena listened carefully, piecing together a clearer picture of the gang's patterns and behaviors. She realized that they were bold but also careless. They underestimated people, assumed fear, and believed they could move through the neighborhood unnoticed. One evening, Lena decided to walk through the neighborhood with Shadow, testing the environment herself. Shadow's ears twitched at every sound, his nose sniffing the air for clues. Lena noticed a group of teenagers standing near a corner, whispering and glancing toward her home. Shadow tensed immediately, and Lena's heart rate increased. She didn't want confrontation, but she wanted awareness. The teenagers laughed nervously when they saw her and Shadow approaching. Lena walked calmly, confident, letting Shadow lead the way. She didn't need to speak. Shadow's presence alone conveyed that they were being watched. The teenagers quickly dispersed, leaving Lena with a sense of quiet satisfaction. As days passed, Lena realized that the gang had left more than just physical evidence behind. They had left a psychological mark as well. Her home felt less like a sanctuary, and she knew she had to reclaim that sense of safety. She began installing subtle security measures, extra locks on doors, motion sensor lights outside, and careful arrangements of furniture to make the house easier to monitor. She also made a habit of checking all the exits and windows before leaving or going to bed. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparedness. Shadow played a crucial role in Lena's vigilance. He was more than a dog. He was a partner in observation. Lena noticed how he would sometimes stay still for long stretches, ears pointed, tracking sounds she could barely hear. When she checked the perimeter, he would circle quietly, marking places she might have overlooked. It became clear to Lena that Shadow's intuition was a gift she could rely on, and together, they formed a careful balance of human intelligence and canine instinct. During this time, Lena also reflected on her own feelings. She had always been independent, proud of managing her life without needing to rely on others. But she realized that independence didn't mean isolation. She understood that reaching out to neighbors, gathering information, and seeking support when necessary was a form of strength, not weakness. Her pride in herself and Shadow gave her courage, but connecting with others added perspective and insight that she could not gain alone. Lena also began thinking about the gang more personally. They were people who had chosen to hurt others, motivated by greed and prejudice. She didn't know why they had chosen her, but she realized that their assumptions about her made them careless. They thought fear would control her, that being alone meant she was powerless. Lena felt a quiet anger at this assumption. She knew she could turn their misjudgment into their downfall, but she had to act with intelligence and patience. She started making small, careful observations about patterns she noticed in the neighborhood. Certain times of day seemed to attract suspicious activity. Specific streets were more prone to loitering, and cars appeared repeatedly in odd places. Lena documented everything, taking photos, noting license plates, and mapping the area. Shadow helped by following scents, alerting her to hidden paths or overlooked details. Lena realized that their combined abilities, her attention to detail, and his instincts, were giving them an advantage she could use later. One morning, Lena received a tip from a neighbor who had seen the gang leaving a stash in an abandoned lot a few streets away. Lena's heart raced. This was the first real lead she had. She discussed it with Shadow, almost as if he could understand the plan. They walked carefully to the location, staying alert to any signs of the gang or other dangers. Shadow's nose led the way, and Lena followed quietly, noting every detail. The lot was cluttered, abandoned furniture and broken signs scattered across the ground. Among the debris, Lena spotted bags and items she recognized, things stolen from her home. Her pulse quickened, but she remained calm. She knew she needed evidence, not confrontation. Lena carefully documented the scene, taking photos and notes. She didn't touch anything unnecessarily, wanting to preserve the integrity of the evidence. Shadow remained alert, ears twitching, growling softly at the faint noises of the neighborhood. Lena felt a sense of triumph mixed with determination. She now had concrete proof, a way to connect the gang to the crimes. This was the turning point. She had moved from being a passive observer to someone taking action, preparing for the moment when justice would be required. That night, Lena returned, home with Shadow, feeling a sense of purpose she had not felt before. The break-in had left scars, but it had also sparked a transformation in her approach to life and safety. She knew the gang had underestimated her, and she also knew that underestimation could be their undoing. Shadow lay beside her as she planned, the next steps carefully, reviewing the evidence, thinking about the police, and considering how to ensure the stolen items could be recovered. Lena felt a mixture of pride, courage, and calm determination. By the end of the week, Lena had a plan. She would continue documenting everything, strengthen her home security, and work closely with the authorities to ensure the gang could not return. Shadow would continue to be her protector, her silent observer, and her partner in vigilance. Lena realized that while fear had been a natural response, courage and preparation were more powerful. Together, she and Shadow were no longer just victims. They were strategists, ready to reclaim control of their home, their neighborhood, and their peace of mind. Lena also began to notice a shift in herself. She felt more aware, more connected to her surroundings, and more confident in her ability to handle whatever came next. Shadow, sensing her resolve, became even more alert and protective, his loyalty deepening in ways that Lena appreciated but never took for granted. They had faced a threat and survived, and now they were preparing to face it on their own terms. After days of careful observation, Lena finally felt ready to act. She had studied the gang's patterns, documented evidence, and learned their habits without ever being noticed. Shadow stayed close to her side as always, his eyes alert, his ears twitching at every sound. Lena knew that confronting the gang directly would be dangerous, but she also understood that she didn't need to face them alone. She had Shadow, her intelligence, and the advantage of knowing the neighborhood better than they did. Early one morning, Lena decided to make her move. She prepared herself carefully, taking a backpack with her phone, a small flashlight, and her notebook filled with all the details she had collected. Shadow walked quietly beside her as they left, the house moving down the street in the soft light of dawn. The neighborhood was still sleepy, the streets empty except for a few cars parked along the curbs. Lena's heart beat steadily, not from fear but from focus. She had a mission, and every step she took was part of a careful plan. They approached the area where the gang had hidden some of the stolen items. Lena had walked this route before, memorizing every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. Shadow's nose twitched constantly, and Lena followed his lead, letting him guide them through alleys and side streets that offered both cover and safety. She marveled at his instincts. Shadow could sense things she could not, hear things she could not, and his loyalty made him a partner she could fully trust. When they reached the abandoned lot, Lena paused to assess the surroundings. The air smelled faintly of dust and decay, and broken furniture and discarded items were scattered across the ground. Lena spotted the bags and containers she had noticed before, now partially hidden behind debris. She took careful photos from a safe distance, documenting the evidence without touching anything. Shadow crouched beside her, growling softly at a noise in the distance. Lena held her hand up to him, signaling calm, and he relaxed slightly but stayed alert. While documenting the site, Lena noticed movement in the distance. A car drove slowly down the street, its occupants clearly scanning the area. Lena's pulse quickened, but she remained calm. She whispered to Shadow, "Stay with me, boy. Let's see what they're up to." Shadow's ears twitched, and he moved silently beside her. The car stopped for a moment, then drove off. But Lena now knew that the gang had not forgotten this location. They would likely check back, and that gave Lena an opportunity. She decided to set a small, clever trap, not to harm anyone, but to ensure that the gang's return would leave proof of their actions. Lena used a few of the bags from the lot, placing them in a way that would make movement noticeable. She scattered a little flour on the ground near the edges, knowing that footprints would be easy to see later. Shadow watched her every move, his tail flicking with interest. Lena smiled at him. "You'll see, boy. They won't know what hit them." Over the next few days, Lena continued her careful surveillance. She noticed small signs that the gang had been back in the neighborhood, though they hadn't approached the lot yet. She recorded license plate numbers, watched patterns of movement, and made careful notes of every detail. Shadow was her constant companion, his presence both protective and comforting. Lena realized that his intelligence and loyalty were as crucial to her plan as her own careful thinking. One evening, Lena saw a familiar car slow down near the corner of the street. Her heart raced with anticipation. Shadow immediately stiffened, ears pointed, and growled low in his throat. Lena held his leash tightly, watching as the gang approached the lot. They moved cautiously, unaware of the subtle traps Lena had set. The flour on the ground revealed footprints immediately, marking the path they took. Lena took photos discreetly from a distance, capturing evidence that could later be shown to the police. Shadow stayed hidden, watching them closely, ready to alert Lena to any sudden movement. The gang reached the bags Lena had arranged and began rifling through them. Lena noted their behavior carefully. They were careless, laughing among themselves, still believing they were in control. They did not notice the small marks Lena had left, nor the footprints that documented their every movement. She could see the arrogance in their posture, the assumption that no one was watching. Lena felt a quiet satisfaction. Their overconfidence would be their undoing. After a while, the gang left the lot, unaware that Lena had captured everything she needed. She waited a few minutes to ensure they were gone, then approached the area to inspect the results. The footprints, the disturbed bags, and the subtle marks Lena had left all told a story of their presence. She photographed everything carefully, making sure she had clear evidence for the police. Shadow circled the perimeter, sniffing for any remaining traces, ensuring that the site was safe before they left. With evidence in hand, Lena contacted the local authorities. She presented the photos, the maps, and the notes she had meticulously prepared. She explained the patterns she had observed, the locations of the hidden items, and the behavior of the gang. The officers listened carefully, impressed by her detail and careful planning. They promised to increase patrols in the area and investigate the locations Lena had identified. Lena felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that her efforts and Shadow's vigilance had turned a dangerous situation into an opportunity for justice. Despite the progress with the authorities, Lena knew she could not relax completely. She continued her routines, walking the neighborhood with Shadow, checking doors and windows, and observing for any unusual activity. Shadow remained alert, his presence a constant reminder that they were a team. Lena felt a growing confidence in herself and her abilities. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and danger, and she had emerged stronger and more capable. The next few days brought small victories. Items that had been stolen were quietly recovered by the authorities, thanks in part to the evidence Lena had collected. Neighbors began to notice increased police presence, and some even approached Lena to thank her for her courage and careful planning. She remained modest, attributing the success to Shadow's loyalty and the careful observation she had maintained. She knew that without him the plan would have been far more difficult, and she made sure to give him the praise he deserved. As the days passed, Lena noticed that the gang had become more cautious. They no longer moved as freely in the neighborhood, and their previous arrogance had been replaced by hesitation. Lena felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that her careful actions and Shadow's vigilance had made a real difference. She had not sought confrontation, but she had ensured that the gang could not continue their actions unchecked. The balance of power had shifted, and Lena felt the sense of control she had lost during the initial break-in slowly returning. Shadow, ever watchful, continued to accompany Lena everywhere. Whether they were walking the neighborhood, tending the garden, or simply sitting on the porch, he remained alert to the world around him. Lena often marveled at his intelligence and loyalty, realizing that he was more than a pet. He was her partner, her protector, and a constant source of comfort and courage. Together they had turned fear into action and uncertainty into strategy. By the end of the week, Lena felt a sense of peace returning to her home. The neighborhood was quieter, the gang more cautious, and her confidence in herself and Shadow stronger than ever. She knew that they had not only reclaimed control of their home, but they had also sent a message. They would not be underestimated, ignored, or intimidated. Shadow rested at her feet that night as Lena reflected on the events of the past weeks. They had faced real danger, observed it carefully, and acted with intelligence and courage. The bond between them had deepened, and Lena felt a profound sense of gratitude for her loyal companion. Even as she prepared for bed, Lena's mind remained alert. She knew the gang could still be in the area, but she also knew that preparedness, intelligence, and loyalty were stronger than fear. Shadow lifted his head, ears perked, as if sensing her thoughts. Lena smiled, stroking his fur. "We're ready, boy. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Shadow's tail thumped gently against the floor, a silent promise of protection and partnership. Lena understood now that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She had transformed from someone reacting to danger into someone who planned, observed, and protected. Shadow had been there every step of the way, his instincts guiding her, his loyalty strengthening her resolve. Together, they had taken control of a situation that had initially seemed frightening and uncertain. They had turned the tables on the gang, ensuring that their actions would not go unchallenged. That night, Lena slept more peacefully than she had in days. Shadow curled at the foot of her bed, ever vigilant. She knew there would always be challenges in life, but she also knew that with careful observation, intelligence, and loyalty, she could face them and protect what mattered most. Together, she and Shadow had proven that courage, preparation, and partnership could overcome even the boldest threats. The next few days were quiet, but Lena did not let herself relax completely. Shadow stayed by her side at all times, alert and attentive as ever. The neighborhood seemed calmer, and the police had increased their presence, checking streets and abandoned lots. But Lena knew better than to believe the danger had completely vanished. The gang had been bold and reckless, but they had also learned quickly that they had underestimated her. Lena felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that she and Shadow had shifted the balance of power, but she also knew that vigilance would always be necessary. One morning, as Lena and Shadow walked their usual path through the neighborhood, she noticed something different. The gang's presence was thinner. The cars that had once lingered suspiciously were gone. People were moving more freely, and some even waved at Lena as she passed by. It was a small sign of victory, but it meant more than that. It meant that her efforts were paying off. Shadow sniffed the ground, ears twitching, alert to the faintest trace of a scent, and Lena felt grateful for his instincts. Together, they had managed to protect their home and reclaim a sense of safety for their neighborhood. Lena began visiting the abandoned lot again, the place where she had first found the gang's hidden items. The bags had been removed, evidence collected, and the area was quieter now. She walked carefully among the debris, observing the signs of the gang's departure. There were subtle hints that the authorities had been there, footsteps that did not belong to the neighborhood residents and small markers that indicated inspection. Lena took photos documenting everything for her own records. Shadow stayed close, his presence a comforting reminder that she was not alone, even in places that had once felt threatening. The authorities had been impressed by Lena's evidence, and they had begun taking action. Officers returned to the neighborhood more regularly, checking homes and abandoned lots. Some of the stolen items had been recovered and returned to their owners. Lena felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her careful observations and planning had contributed directly to these results. Shadow sat beside her on the porch one evening as she reflected on the past weeks, his head resting on her lap as if sharing in her sense of accomplishment. As Lena continued her routines, she noticed a subtle change in the neighborhood. People seemed more confident, moving about without fear. Children played outside again, and neighbors began talking more openly about what had happened. Some even thanked Lena quietly, acknowledging the courage and determination that had helped restore a sense of security. Lena accepted their gratitude, modestly, knowing that the true hero was Shadow, whose loyalty and instincts had been crucial at every step. One afternoon, Lena received a call from the local police. They had arrested several members of the gang, and they credited her detailed evidence and observations as key to locating them. Lena felt a mixture of relief and quiet triumph. It had been a tense and dangerous situation, but her careful planning, patience, and Shadow's constant presence had made a real difference. The arrests brought a sense of closure to a chapter that had begun with fear and uncertainty. Even after the gang members were taken into custody, Lena continued to focus on vigilance. She reinforced her home with extra locks and security measures, ensuring that her space remained safe. Shadow continued his patrols, sniffing the perimeter, listening to every sound, and remaining alert to anything unusual. Lena had learned that peace was not something granted. It was something earned through careful observation, preparation, and action. Together, she and Shadow had created that peace, and they were determined to maintain it. Neighbors began to take notice of Lena's resilience. Some approached her to ask how she had managed to stay calm, and